Welcome, everyone, to the After the Gate podcast, your number one source for authentic stories, interviews, and educational content surrounding the justice system, incarceration, and more. Come along with us now as we give you a glimpse before and after the gate.
Yo, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast, After the Gate, the coolest podcast this side of captivity. I'm your host, Alexander the Great, and we have a special guest today. We're super excited to jump in to hear her story and just her experiences throughout, because we talk about incarceration and things of re-entry, the experiences, and just how that connects with the world. So to jump into everything, let's start with your name, age, and location.
My name is Lindsy Floyd. I'm 38 and I live in Eastern Connecticut.
Very nice. Lindsy, so give us a little update. Like, what was life for you growing up? What was adolescence for you? What was your upbringing? Was it privileged? Was it inner city? Did you grow up in the country? Give us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I grew up in Salt Lake City as a non-Mormon, which, in the 80s and 90s, Salt Lake was like 90% Mormon. And right now it's totally changed and is more like less than 50% Mormon. So the social dynamic is certainly a lot different now. But when I was growing up, I was kind of in that non-Mormon minority. But I was definitely in kind of like middle to upper class. I was on the good side of town. I went to the good high school. I have a great family and great support system. And I think my parents did just about the best job at getting divorced that I've ever seen. They set a really good example for how they got along after and how they supported my brother and I after. When I went to college, both of my parents and their spouses took me down to school and we all had breakfast together, and it was all very normal and supportive. And I feel really grateful for that, especially now that I know all the things I know. So my childhood was pretty wonderful.
So you had mentioned that they went through a divorce and they handled it really, really well. What age was that for you?
I was 10.
10. Okay. And how old was your brother at the time?
He was 7.
7. Okay. Very nice. So during this time of childhood, was there like this revelation of like finding yourself through this ordeal that your parents were going through? Was there where would it turn from like a privileged lifestyle to maybe poor choices or negative influences?
Well, all of that didn't happen until I was an adult. I feel like my normal struggles as a teen. After my parents got divorced, I was struggling in school and kind of starting to hang out with the wrong crowds. My parents pulled me out of school and put me in a different one. And, then I graduated with almost a 4.0. So, none of really the traumas that I experienced that led to my incarceration happened before I met my abuser. And that was when I was 19.
You were 19 years old. Okay. So once you met your abuser, how did life change completely for you in the sense of leading up to your incarceration?
I've reflected on it so much, and it's so hard to say, like, to look at it from all that I know now, because at the time when I was 19, I was so excited to be a grown-up. I was so excited to, get married and have kids. And, part of that was the Mormon culture that I was raised in, where most kids graduated from high school, went on a mission for 2 years, and then got married and had kids. And so even though that wasn't part of my family's history, it was certainly in the culture and around me and that sort of thing. And so I was really focused on, I want to grow up. I want to have all of the grown up things. And so I met this guy who was 29, and I didn't know then that it was toxic. I didn't know then, like, the terms gaslighting, manipulation, narcissism. I was completely naive to all of that. And so, he comes from a family with money, and I saw the potential to travel. I saw that he had this adult life, and I was kind of, looking at it through rose-colored lenses, and he was putting it on as a big, pretty show. So it wasn't until many years later that I realized that I was kind of the lobster in the pot, so to speak.
Yeah. Did you have support from your family just when you were in this relationship that was causing this turmoil? Did you have support from your loved ones, your family?
Yeah, absolutely. And like any typical abusive relationship, it never starts out bad. The first few years, I got my bachelor's degree, I earned my master's degree, we had a child. I mean, all of those things were present. A lot
Mhm.
of the things that were red flags that I should have been concerned about, I was pretty unaware of, but my family was definitely supportive and played an active role in my life.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, Lindsay. So, touching on your incarceration, we don't have to like leading up to the day of your arrest. Had you ever been arrested? Have you had ever dealt with the police? Ticket, anything of that sort?
Sort of. I'm going to say, my arrest was my first one with an asterisk. When I was in
Yep.
grad school, I was also affiliated with a nonprofit organization called Peaceful Uprising. And our mission was to defend a livable future by empowering nonviolent direct action. So it was based on climate change and environmental justice. And the reputation of the organization was one where we were often at events where people chose to break the law through civil disobedience. And one such event, 26 of us ended up getting arrested because we blocked traffic in downtown Salt Lake for a while. But the chief of police had been working with us for years as an organization. We always had permits for all of our demonstrations and protests. And, that event was pretty high profile. And so the chief of police and his department were incredibly well prepared. And I think they were invested in having it serve as kind of a PR thing for them too, of how well they handle people who exercise their First Amendment rights. So, the 26
Yeah,
of us,
yeah.
most of us were white. We were privileged. We had the organization, we had media around us. The cops were really nice to
Mhm.
us. I think I was asked 3 or 4 times, if you would like to leave the intersection now, you won't be arrested. Would you like to leave? I'd say, no, thank you. I mean, so was that really an
Yep, yep,
arrest? I mean, there were pleases and thank yous, and the cops helped us into the bus when we got called off.
yep, yeah.
And, it ended up being an infraction, like lower than a misdemeanor, and then it was dropped. So I didn't do
Yep,
any
yep.
hard time. Like it was this fun Disneyland, like, look at us, empowered young grad students kind of thing. But
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
I don't think I would count that because I certainly did not get any of the same treatment when I was arrested.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure a lot of the time I ask those questions because I feel like, it's either one upbringing is like, I'm totally prepared for this prison experience, or one that's like, oh, it's shock, this isn't what I'm used to, which is mostly the case for you. So leading up to let's say the day or the night of your arrest, can you just tell us maybe the 24 hours leading up to it, or if maybe it was 2 weeks or whatever, just what was on your mind leading up to that day that you would
Mm,
ultimately get arrested and be brought to jail?
I think to
Like,
fully
did you
answer
feel it in
that,
your body? Did you?
well, I have to go
Yeah,
back a little bit before 24 hours. In that abusive
yeah,
relationship, the 3 or 4 years prior to its end were really dark. And it was during those times that he was arrested for domestic violence a handful of times. And we kept moving to different states, kind of thinking that it was our location that was causing all the problems. And I didn't have the tools yet to say, no, it's because this is abuse. It was still this kind of naive situation. And so we had chosen to move to Connecticut as kind of yet another last ditch effort to save the marriage kind of thing. And we made it 3 days. We ended up in having a huge explosive fight. He was arrested. I was sent to the ER and I had my scalp stapled back together. And it was then that I left him. And that's when I moved back to Utah. And the few months after I left him and before the accident are so inextricably linked in my mind that, I mean, that I see is like where my path to prison was born. I was fully ill equipped to deal with leaving an abuser. I didn't know that I needed to grieve. I didn't know how to. I was filled with anger and really bright, uncontrollable rage. And I felt like I was never going to be able to get free from him. I mean, despite us living 2,500 miles away from each other and having restraining orders, he would call my work, or I'd come home and my power would be shut off and I'd call the power company and they'd say, oh, your husband called, said that you had moved and to turn it off. And kind of the last straw on the camel's back for me was, I had started dating this guy and things were going really well. And we were being really smart as far as me telling him, like, hey, I just got out of this really terrible relationship, but I like you. So we got to take things slow. And one night my ex had called his mom, like this new guy that I'm falling in love with. His mom from New York calls and says, "Don't you know someone in Connecticut? I'm getting like 100 phone calls nonstop from this phone number in Connecticut." And sure enough, it was him. And so I just had this like overwhelming sense of like, I leave the guy, I move across the country, I try to create this new life. And yet he's still like got me trapped. And I just felt like I was never going to be able to break free. And I was also really ill, like I didn't have any of the resources. I was not taking advantage of my family support. I think I had like the superhero clothing on where I was trying to show the world how strong I was. And like, I felt really embarrassed that I got trapped into abuse, and it really challenged kind of my identity in a way because I was from a very academic, collegiate, nonprofit kind of world where I was given a lot of power in organizations and speaking at conferences and that kind of thing. And then I had this other world where, I mean, some of my darkest, most horrific memories were the last years of my marriage. And I couldn't reconcile how me being smart, like how I didn't catch that sooner. And so I had a lot of really complicated, dark emotions of guilt and shame and panic and despair. And I didn't know what to do with them. And so that was kind of the night before the accident, was holding this heap of burden in my hands and not knowing, like, how do I get rid of this heap of shit? Like, I don't know how. And so right before the accident, I had gone out to lunch with a friend and had a few margaritas and cried all of these sorrows into the margaritas and into my friend of just like, what do I do? How do I move forward and heal from this? And we ended lunch and then I went on to run errands. I mean, I didn't think prison was going to happen that day. I didn't think I was on that path. I think I was still too wrapped up in my own, I don't know, cycle of just despair and sorrow. I was too clouded to see it. It was there though.
Yeah, yeah. So, Lindsay, take us up to the moment. Was it that day after you had left, after you were with your friend, that the incident had occurred that would send you to prison, or was it the following day?
No, it was that day. So the timeline of
It was that
events
day.
was, on a Tuesday night, we got a call from the new boyfriend's mom, and she let me know that she was getting all of these harassing calls. And then the next day, I had lunch with a friend, and 3 hours later, I was arrested.
What were you charged with at the county jail? What were your initial charges?
I was not given any initial charges. I spent 2 nights in the city jail or county jail, which
Hmm.
was horrific in and of itself. And then I
Yep.
wasn't charged for anything for 6 months.
So, so they let you out after those 2 days. What did they tell you after they had released you? Like, did anybody come and speak to a jail supervisor, a prosecutor, a DA,
No.
anything like that? No.
No, and that was like kind of my first awakening of knowing that this was an actually different experience, right? Where,
Hmm.
prison and jail, they don't give you a handbook of what to expect or here's what the next process is. I mean, I was there, I made a few phone calls to my mom and this boyfriend that I was madly in love with. And, he's now my
Hmm.
husband, but I'd made a few phone calls and we had made arrangements to sell my car so I could get an attorney. And we didn't really know anything. And then I was just, someone hollered, one of the guards said, "Floyd, roll up." And they just let me out. And we didn't really know anything. So I met the lawyer and he pretty much said, charges will come. We just don't know when. So in the meantime, just kind of live your life. And there were cops that showed up at my door randomly throughout those 6 months. And my attorney said, don't open the door. They're just going to ask you questions. They're going to incriminate you. Don't interact. And so all of a sudden I was for 6 months kind of living, looking behind my shoulder and terrified of what was going to happen because no one really knew.
Yeah, yeah, that's crazy to wake up every day just thinking, okay, is today the day that they're going to come get me, or is today the day I'm getting arrested, charged? Um, okay, so take us to that 6 month mark, the day they come. Can you give us a rundown of what it looks like? What are you doing? What are you eating? Do you wake up? Who are you with?
Sure. So I want to add just a little bit, like a step in
Yeah,
between
yeah,
those months.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
the accident
Yeah.
happened, went to jail for 2 nights. I got out, and then just kind of nothing. And then about a month later, my ex and abuser had submitted an ex parte motion in court for custody. And I went to the courtroom. It was about 6 weeks after the accident, and that's where I learned that the man had died. So it was through my ex's attorney in a courtroom taking custody away from me that I learned that I had killed someone. And I thought I was going to just like a custody hearing where he was going to say, "Oh, she's a bitch and I want the kid." But instead, it was charges for homicide are imminent. And I had to give her up that same day. So she moved back to Connecticut with my ex, and I still wasn't charged. And then let's see, it was in March. So the accident happened in October, and it was like late March or early April. So about 6 months.
Mhm.
And I was in my apartment, and my dad called and he said, "Linz, you're on the news. You're wanted for murder." And I just said, "I gotta go. I gotta call my lawyer." And I collapsed on the ground and just remember calling my lawyer, and my voice was shaky and my hand was shaky. And I said, "I like, what do I do? Why didn't you know? Why is my dad telling me? Why is it on the news?" And I ended up going and having a hearing, and it was where I pled not guilty. I then spent
Mhm.
3.5 weeks in jail until I was released on bail, and then I was on house arrest for another 4 or 5 months until sentencing.
Until sentencing. I, I can only imagine. So that it's just a crazy timeline from getting arrested, waiting all those months to hear something, and then just seeing yourself on the hearing you're on the news from your father. Um, Man, yeah, I'm sure so many things were going through your head. So okay, so from that point, when you were about to get sentenced, did your attorney have something in plan that like, okay, we're just gonna fight this up until the trial date? Are we gonna take a plea deal? What was that conversation like?
There were talks of a plea deal. I had undergone a couple of evaluations, and I had had a ton of letters of recommendation and character references that I had gathered from, my professional world and my personal world. And from the conversations that my attorney had had with the prosecuting attorney, it sounded like probation was a likely plea. And so walking into sentencing, I mean, I, had my job. I was working full time at a political campaign, and I had told people I would be in the office later that day. So I thought I was going in to get really slapped hard with a, 2-year probation. And it was
Mhm.
instead indeterminate sentencing to prison.
So did they handcuff you right away at
Yep.
the man? That yeah, that's a crazy feeling thinking you're going to lunch and then all of a sudden getting handcuffs and thinking how long is this going to be? Um, okay, so they give you a undetermined amount to your sentence. You said so. You really had no clue. Was there just like they could give this 5 years to 40 years or something? Was there like, or really it was up to the judge to give the sentencing down whatever it was, or was there like some sentencing guidelines that you had to follow?
So the way it works in Utah with their indeterminate sentencing is, it's either a first, second, third degree felony. Mine was a third degree felony. And because of that, it meant that the prison incarceration time range was 0 to 5 years. So that meant as little as no prison, as much as 5 years in prison. And it's not a judge who determines it, it's the Board of Pardons and Parole. So, to like not specific to my own case, but any case, someone is sentenced to prison, they go physically to prison, and then, some short time after their incarceration begins, they get a letter from the Board of Pardons and Parole, and they say, "Your hearing date is on this date." It's at that date, after you've been in prison either a few weeks or months, kind of depending on your case, that you learn the scope of charges. That's usually when they'll tell you, "Okay, we anticipate you'll be out on X date." And then that can always change depending on, if you are a part of certain programs, you get time cuts, if you have good behavior, that sort of thing. So I didn't know how long I'd be in prison until a week before I got out.
Wow. So that, I thought you were going to say a week after you got in, a week before you got out.
Yep.
So, So you were just sitting the entire prison sentence wondering when release was up until 7 days?
Hmm.
That blows my mind.
Well,
Oh
and it
my
was,
goodness.
first of all, it was like so different than anything else I'd ever known in my life, right? Like I had a very academic life before that, and when you go into college, they're like, all right, it's 4 years, this number of credits, this many hours in the day. Like it's almost like this math equation where you just have to figure out how to make it fit, and
Mhm.
then you get a degree. And instead, you go to prison. And when I first got there, I would see other women that I had came in with that same week. They would get their letters from the board, and they'd be seeing the board in 6 weeks, and then they'd be leaving in 4 or 5 months, and I would still not even get a letter from the board. So I was incarcerated about 21 months before I got my letter from the board, and that was just indicating my hearing date. So for the most part, yeah, I was just sitting there not knowing, I can't start my career again. I can't think about reuniting with my daughter. I can't, there's no
Well, life's in
plan
limbo.
for. Yeah, it's just kind of
Yeah.
waiting.
Yeah, yeah. So from that moment, there was all these things that were on standstill. What was life looking like for you the moment you went into prison? Were you going to be on a negative path? Were you I don't know if there was gangs inside the prison you went to or negative aspects. Did you expect to fall into those things, or did you want to take, like, maybe the educational course and a more positive route? What was your thinking at that point?
I had never in my life ran through that possibility as even something to think about. I was incredibly suicidal and depressed for the first 3 or 4 months. I got pretty obsessive over the chemicals in the kitchen. I have a science background, and so I would do these chemical equations late at night in my mind, thinking if I can dehydrate that one enough and concentrate it enough, like trying to think of what a lethal dose would be, because I that was my only response. I mean, I had never ever seen such darkness and just the worst of humanity, and it completely shook me to a core where I didn't even have a it took me a while to even realize I had choices. I thought it was a huge shift in my life, and one that has foundationally changed how I see the world. So it took
Yeah.
me months to even figure out, okay, what do I want to do with this time? And at that point, I knew that I had a lot of anger and rage toward my abuser. I knew that I was blaming him for everything, and yet I was the only one behind bars. And those two things can't be true at the same time, right? And so I realized I had to reconcile that. I realized that what got me into the situation was I failed to grieve and acknowledge my emotions. I failed to access resources and support that I had access to. Like what I should have done is I should have fallen on a heap in my family's home and said, "Mom, Dad, family, give me lots of hugs. Please feed me. I need help. What do I do?" Like I should have asked for their mercy and help. And instead, I was too proud and I didn't want to admit how much my heart had broken. And so I had to learn from those lessons, because those were the things that got me in prison, right? Like I was drinking because I didn't know how to cope with the pain. That was my coping mechanism. So it was a question of, like, how do I get rid of this anger? How do I move forward? How do I create a better life whenever I get out of prison, whether it's tomorrow or in 5 years? Like I need to walk out of here better. And that was kind of my only choice. There were gangs, and over time, I came to say that I'll be friendly with everyone, but friends to no one.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You spoke about how you saw a lot of the dark times in prison, and I don't like to, like, across the podcast. I don't like to talk about like the dark parts of prison. But can you just give us a glimpse of, like, what are some of the things? Maybe a instance inside prison that really, like, shook you to the core, where you were just like, okay, I, I need to get out of here. This isn't where I belong. Did you have any of those epiphany moments? Did you have any, like, really really tough times inside prison? I know you said all of it was the few
Yeah.
first months. I can imagine were really really tough, but just like prison experiences. Like you mentioned, there was some gangs. I'm sure there was violence. I'm sure you weren't used to those type of things. Did you see a lot of that inside prison, inside the women's prison?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there was violence, and I really quickly and early on learned, the rules of social engagement in prison are very different, right? It's almost, in
Mhm.
school, like even as kids, we're given this hypothetical lifeboat situation, right? Where it's like, okay, you're stranded in the middle of an ocean in a lifeboat. It's you and four other people. You only have enough fresh water and food for three of you. Who goes? Right. And you think, okay, well, the teacher could be helpful for this, the engineer might, and so you like rationalize who you dump off the boat. And prison is like that in real life, where I saw friends, like one day they're playing cards and talking about how they're sisters and they're street sisters and blood for life and all of that. And then the other one steals from them the next day. And then they're enemies and they're like willing to engage in all of this hatred and betrayal and backstabbing. And I realized it's not them, it's the situation, right? It's the environment that creates this impossibly amoral situation for every inmate. And
Mhm.
that was kind of, just hard overall to see the suffering and the hurt people who are hurting people.
Yeah.
The one thing that sticks out in my mind as being really earth shattering was when I saw another inmate die. She had a lot of mental health issues and schizophrenia, and it was the first time that I had ever been exposed to someone with schizophrenia directly. I mean, I had read about it, I had seen videos, kind of third person or
Mhm.
secondhand, but the voices that were coming out of her mouth this one night. I mean, I had never been so convinced that mental health is a real thing, even if we can't see it, right? Because I saw how she was
Mhm.
struggling, and she was begging to see a nurse, and the guard didn't believe her, didn't want to. I don't know what was going through his mind, but he, called her
Mhm.
some of the worst names that a human could call another human and locked her in her cell. And she ended up, the door opened when a nurse was coming or something. And so she went and ran over the gate. She was on the second floor, like on the top tier, and she fell. Like she went over the railing and fell and put
Mhm.
her, like her head landed on concrete. And the guards told all of us to freeze. And so I was just standing there watching blood fall out of her body and writhing. And the cops went to get cameras first before they even went to help her. And I can only imagine it's a cover your own ass, like kind of thing for the guards. But they set up all these tripods and hit record and got all of the other inmates locked down, probably 2 or 3 minutes of time before helping this woman. And she died before they even took her out of the pod that we were in. And I had never seen cruelty in that kind of way, and
Mhm.
just such a disregard for someone's well-being. And clearly that woman was struggling that night and she needed help. And the callousness of those guards was just, it's still haunting to this day to think that people have the capacity, like we all have that capacity within us to be that wicked, right? Under the right conditions.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Prison is extremely traumatizing to some people, and I can only imagine witnessing that. Like, you think that a guard should be doing the human thing and reacting to help or to aid this individual, and in reality, look what they're doing is covering their own butt, or they could have
Yeah.
saved that woman's life. Maybe that's so sad. I'm so sorry to hear that you had to witness that.
Well, thank
Um,
you.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that's not cool. I feel like prison. I don't know. My brother goes to a therapist, and he's been incarcerated too, but they labeled him with PTSD, and he like laughs about it, but he thinks like the therapist is so serious about like you have PTSD. Like normal people do not witness these things inside prison. Like you've seen things that are insane. This is traumatizing for you to witness. And prison leaves that on people. Just I mean, you'll remember this for the rest of your life. You remember these things, the feelings, the
Yeah.
dreams, the nightmares, all of it. So, um, within prison, what was there like this fuel towards your positive change, or you wanted to be this new person when you got out? Was there a community? Was there a mentor? Was there a friend? Was there a support circle on the outside that like I know initially it's probably you that fueled it all, but what was it that was kind of promoting it inside the prison facility?
It was a gift that I was able to be housed at the prison. The first year I was transferred to like 5 different county jails. Utah does this thing where it's called countying out, or you county out an inmate. And so you take a state inmate and relocate them to a county that is more rural and not as crowded so that you can have enough housing. So I kind of bopped around all of these different locations for the first year. And I was at one facility for 3 months, another one for 5 months. And each one had its own communication availability. You know, one facility only allowed postcards, which was ridiculous. Another facility had this little like tablet kind of thing where it was super expensive to basically send someone a text message. And then at the prison, once I finally got there and spent my last year or so there, that's when I had letters, and I was able to send an envelope with 10 pieces of paper in it. And that was really what shifted for me, because it allowed me to find my own voice and find my own path. You know, I am so fortunate to have the privilege that I have, especially having heard so many stories from women in prison and what their own upbringings look like and what their support system looks like. I mean, so many people are caught in this like catch-22 where they're released from prison and said, well, go find support, but not with anyone who has a criminal history or who has any kind of crime or drug or anything. And it's like, well, that's your whole family. So that's a really tough choice. I mean, the people that you love, that you spend Christmas with, that you mourn funerals with and celebrate weddings with, are also criminals that you can't legally interact with. And so I had this wonderful support system. And, you know, my mom, she ended up sending me this like package every week full of different articles about things that she knew I was interested in. And I reached out to a lot of people that I had been inspired by in my own life in the past. There was a pastor from a Unitarian church that I really love that church. And it was where I lost my anger for religion. Was through the Unitarian church. And I began to see the beautiful side of it. And so I reached out to that pastor and started seeing if he would engage in a dialogue with me through letter form. One of the most transformative things that I did was participate in this writing program called Prison Ed. And it's, you know, Prison Education Foundation. And it's this guy, Don Wright, and he wrote a book called Freedom Behind Bars. And in each chapter, it highlights someone who's been incarcerated, but who had used that kind of to fuel the good work that they did later on. So think Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Louis Zamperini, you know, kind of inspiring stories. And then there were writing prompts. And it was, you know, how did Louis Zamperini overcome these struggles? Like what parts of his story do you recognize? And, you know, it led me down the perfect kind of path that I needed for me. You know, the prison itself, they put me in a class about heroin, and I've never done heroin. So it was a mismatched class, right? Where the tools I was supposed to be learning, it's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. Like, I've never been addicted to heroin. I empathize with those who struggle with that addiction. It's horrific, but this is not useful for me. So when I found the kind of, you know, writing and book option, that's where I kind of found some hope and found a path.
Yeah. Talk about just misappropriation of resources and funding, just putting people into classes that don't make sense, putting the resources. It blows my mind that the prison, I'm not going to say all prison systems, but the majority of prison systems, I think, lack in what's fueling positive outcomes and less recidivism for people going back. I'm like you said, the support systems of people that, you know, are in there, 9 out of 10 have burnt the bridges or committed crimes that their family doesn't want anything to do with them. Or like you said, they can't go around them anyways. So, I mean, getting out and reentry is so much harder for them. When you were about to get out a week before, you pretty much had only that time of your incarceration to prepare to just get released in a week. So really, you didn't have much of a plan, right? Were you actively planning, like, okay, I'm just going to jump into this now that I've heard? What was it like from like the week prior? Okay, this is what Lindsay has to do.
My partner and we had already kind of discussed theoretically what we would do after, right? And I had discussed it with my family. So I had kind of a loose plan before my board hearing. And the loose plan was, you know, okay, step 1, get out of prison. Step 2, like acclimate to new life, because all of the inmates around me, they nicknamed me Google because I was the dork who liked to read books and write letters, and I didn't play cards, and I didn't have sex in the shower. And like, they kind of, figured out who I was toward the end of it. And so they were like, what are you going to do, man? Like, they're like, I don't think you realize how big of a transition it is to like go back in the world. And so I had a lot of anxiety about that, of like, how much has this place permeated and sunk into my soul? Like, I don't know, right? I've never had this experience of getting out of prison, or being in prison. So I had no idea what to expect. And so I knew that reuniting with my daughter was one of the important things. I knew that she was in Connecticut and I was in prison in Utah. So at some point I knew that those needed to change. Like the one in Connecticut, one in Utah wasn't going to work. So we had talked about moving to Connecticut, but all in kind of vague future, like down the line kind of terms. And so when I went to my board meeting, I had a lot of people show up and support me, which was beautiful. A lot of the, people I had written with, the pastor from the Unitarian Church, a lot of my family and friends, they all showed up to advocate for me. And, it's such an interesting thing to go in front of a panel of people and try to convince them that you're worthy of freedom. It's like, you're not supposed to sound like a sales pitch, but you're supposed to be emotionally vulnerable, but you're supposed to be concise. And, I tried my best, but still it was a really strange circumstance, a really interesting power dynamic. And so I, finished up the hearing, and then I went back to where my cell was. And there were a few days where I didn't know anything, just kind of a wait and see game, right? They let you know when they're ready. And if, like, about a week later, one of the case managers called me into his office and he said, well, you have 5 days, pack your bags, you leave on Tuesday. And I think it was like a Thursday or Friday. And it was just disbelief, like that it was real.
Yeah. So were you able to, did they cut off your communications? Were you able to call and say like, hey, I'm going to be getting out? Like, did they cut anything off from you, or like in the event that you could plan anything, or?
Sure. Yeah, no, they didn't cut anything off. The prison that I was in, it was a privilege system, right? So if you did your chores and you had a job and you didn't mouth off to the guards, you got the higher level of privilege and, that kind of thing. And so they didn't cut anything off. I remember making a lot of phone calls. I called my daughter, I called my spouse, I called my family, and it was just, we all collectively just had this like shock of awe and disbelief. Like, we never thought that this storm was going to pass, kind of thing.
Yeah. So what about if you could say with inside prison, maybe somebody you met, or certain circumstance, maybe one night, maybe it was a holiday or something you were going through, like anything that stands out the most during your time in prison? Do you have any circumstances, any times that really, really stand out to you? Any holidays, anybody you met, any conversations you had?
I met some really fantastic women there once I allowed myself to open up to friendship. I think going in, I was so terrified of all of these evil criminals, right? Like, I knew about prison what Hollywood shared. And so it took some time for me to understand what a farce that Hollywood notion of what prison is. It's just crap. It's not like it at all. And there was this one woman I met who was charged with sex offending crimes, which, in the hierarchy of the prison I was in, that was kind of the lowest ranking one, that most other inmates treated sex offenders really poorly. But she knew how to crochet. And I got in the habit of crocheting things for my daughter, to the point where I'd crochet, stuffed animals and dresses and everything else. And so I was really stuck on this one, crochet loop that I couldn't figure out how to do it. And so I asked her if she would help me. And at first, a lot of the other inmates were critical, wanting to know why I was talking to her and that I really shouldn't be hanging around with her. But she was really nice. And over the course of a few weeks, as she was teaching me how to crochet better, she opened up and shared a lot about her own story. And, I think hers is anecdotal to most people's prison story. And that's that she was hurt and traumatized and put in a really bad situation in life. And she had a series of terrible choices in front of her, and she chose one because she didn't have any good choices. And, it's her story. So I want to respect, some form of anonymity, but the case involved her daughter and her daughter being exchanged for rent. And the part that really stood out as heartbreaking to me is that she was in an abusive relationship with a spouse who was financially controlling her. And at the time, exchanging her teenage daughter for rent money with the landlord was the least bad option out of a series of bad options she had. And it really allowed me to break through the illusion that anyone is a criminal at all, right? That anyone's a bad person, whether a sex offender or, in my case, a murderer. I mean, we in society allow these labels to perpetrate just this huge, powerful aura around someone as if it makes them fundamentally different. And all of the women that I met ended up showing me like how human we all are and how we all share grief and sorrow and joy and desire and dream. And so she was one that was really influential for me. And then I had the privilege of living with two women, both of whom I got to live with for longer than normal. I mean, in total, I probably lived with like 60 women over the 2 years or so. But two of them I was with for a few months. And one of them was very different than me. She was a Mormon, and I was really grateful that she and I were able to have conversations that we disagreed, but respectfully so, at least as far as religion was concerned. And that was a really wonderful experience because we were able to have a lot of commonalities and talk about our life struggles through lenses of religion, but not fighting over it, right? It would be like, she would say something like, well, in my world, my God does this. And I would say, well, in my world, the universe does that, and so we kind of had this like agree to disagree or agree to, use certain terms. And that was a really valuable gift, even if it wasn't in prison, just to be able to have those kinds of conversations with someone without there being hatred or defensiveness.
Yeah, yeah. I think too, like with my personal prison experience, going to prison, like you said, sex offenders are looked upon as like the lowest of the low. And I think that was, that mob mentality is easy to fall into, as with all the prison aspects. But I think that, if you're really trying to change, you, like you said, you have to accept, you can't let these labels be accustomed to people, and you have to, if you believe in second chances for one person, you almost have to believe them for every single person and for the whole prison as a whole. So, I mean, I think too, that's becoming more human and not falling into that mob mentality of like, this is what the prison way thinks. This is what the street life thinks. This is what criminal living thinks, or, that type of lifestyle. I'm glad that you were able to have those conversations and meet those people, because you'll probably never have that same conversation ever again. Never, unless you end up in prison,
Yeah.
Which,
Well, and
yeah,
that's the
never
thing. I
again.
mean, prison did lend itself to some really special and unique things that I never would have experienced otherwise. I'm really grateful for the humility that I gained, in being able to see some other person's humanity and to be kind and empathetic and to hold space for someone else's heart while in prison is a tremendous gift. I am so grateful that women trusted me with some really horrific stories, right? I mean, these are things that weigh people down for their entire lives and fundamentally define them. And there were women who were willing to share that with me. And I really am privileged to have that in my life. The other thing I was really grateful for was how many books I could read. I mean, in that last year of prison, I was reading 6 or 7 books a week. And I remember thinking, it was maybe about 8 months before I left prison, I need to be grateful for this, because I know that I'm not going to have another chunk of time in my life where I can read 6 or 7 books in a week. I just know that. And sure enough, I mean, I got out of prison in 5 years ago, and I have never read that many books since.
No. Inside prison, it really gives you that time to focus on yourself and just, yeah. Same with me. I was probably reading like 5 to 6 books a week. It felt good.
Yeah. Yeah,
You
but
speak better. Mind's going good.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really beautiful things, right? I mean, I've thought about it almost like a parallel to a yoga retreat, right? I mean, I think about that movie and book, Eat, Pray, Love, right? So a woman goes through a divorce and she's got to find herself. And so she goes and spends 4 months in Bali and 4 months in Italy and 4 months somewhere else to laugh and find love. And, first of all, I didn't have the money for that. But like, prison was that for me. I mean, it was a lot harder than a fun retreat in Bali, but it forced me into, you are obligated now for self exploration, for self improvement, for self growth. This is what you're doing now. And it just kind of forced me into it. And I don't know that I ever would have made all of the changes and grown as much as I did if I wasn't forced into that situation.
Yeah. That struggle hitting rock bottom made you grow, made you do the growing.
Yeah. Well, and the other reality too that I think of is, if it wasn't that accident, it would have been something else, because it was
worse.
Well, yeah, I mean,
worse.
I had so much grief in my heart, and it wasn't going anywhere. It was growing, right? It was like callousing my heart and killing my soul, and I was so wrapped up in this, like, it's his fault. He's a piece of crap. I'm so angry at him. Why did he do this all to me? Like it was just this one channel, and it was not going to take me anywhere in life. And so if it wasn't that, it would have been worse. Maybe it would have been my life. Maybe it would have been my daughter's. Maybe it would have been God knows what. But I know that if it wasn't that, it would have been something.
Would have been something. So Lindsay, with your reentry, let's talk. You're getting out of prison. Let's talk the maybe the 24 hours. Who's waiting outside those prison gates?
It is still to this day one of the best days and weirdest days of my life. My mom and my partner picked me up, and the night before I had called them, and we talked about what time they'd get there, and I said, now no hugs, right? Like, just get me out and then we'll hug later. And so sure enough, we're in this like weird little transportation waiting room, and they start hugging me and I start hugging them, and I'm like, wait, no, we should leave. And
get out of here.
Yeah. So we got in the car and we drove a few blocks, and then I got out, and on the side of the highway, I changed my clothes out of prison clothes into non-prison clothes.
Yes.
And that was, gosh, what a wonderful creature comfort. I never really understood fashion until that moment, right? Like why women would spend like hundreds of dollars on cashmere or something never crossed my mind as to why. And then I slipped on a non-prison thing, and I was like, oh, this is why. This is why.
Thank goodness. Yeah.
So we did that, and then we went to my mom's house, and my whole family was there. All my parents and my siblings and grandparents, and my brother brought the most delicious fruit over. He went and found all of the exotic fruit, right? Like a dragon fruit and mango and pineapple and kiwi and cherries. And I mean, it was delicious. Yeah. And my mom made BLTs with garden tomatoes, and it was amazing, and it was overwhelming. And I felt really unsure of how to act. Mm-hmm. Like I just felt like I had to move really slowly through whatever I was doing. And then after we spent some time with my family, my partner and I went to a coffee house, and I picked a cup of coffee, and I remember looking at the menu just thinking, I don't know what I want. Like, there's so many choices.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine you had that same kind of like similar thing of getting out, like,
yeah. I think for people out there that never been incarcerated or whatever, just getting out of jail after a month or two, like, people don't think that life changes. This world moves so fast. Like, you get out and people are saying different things. The lingo's different. The clothes is different. Just everything is the world changes so quickly. And I don't know. I think it could, like I said, it could have been 2 months, 2 years, 20 years. Life's going to be a total transformation. Lindsay, for everybody that's still sitting in prison, or like families that are listening, what was the easiest and maybe the hardest part of reentry for you? Some people getting out don't have resources, don't have maybe a support circle. There's the things like clothing, shelter, job. What were the things that were the hardest for you or the easiest for you with reentry?
I, again, am going to recognize my privilege, and it's something I'm so fortunate to have. And I'm so sorry that so many other people who are transitioning out of incarceration don't have.
Yep.
My partner gave me a cell phone, like handed me a cell phone that he bought for me, and it had a phone number and it was all set up, and I didn't know how to use it because I hadn't used a cell phone in years. He already had a place for me to live. He had already hung up all of my clothes. Like my family, when I went to prison, they collectively took the obligation of like packing my clothes away and doing something with all my stuff. And then before I got out, they unpacked it. And one of my moms went and got me shampoo and conditioner and body wash and makeup. And, everyone kind of like restocked me. It was almost like a homecoming. And that wasn't a struggle at all. My partner had been working and had saved up money. I mean, it wasn't like he was wealthy and like we're flying first class or anything, but I didn't have to worry about food or rent or my cell phone bill. I mean, my family really put no pressures on me. I also had the privilege of having a really easy parole stipulation. I was not to leave the state of Utah and I was not to be in a bar, basically. Those were my two stipulations. Don't drink and don't go out of Utah. I know a lot of other people, other people transitioning off of parole have to meet with their parole officers once a week, or they have daily drug tests or random drug tests. And I didn't have anything like that. So I think in a lot of ways, it was really my choice of what I wanted my reentry to look like because I didn't have the constraints that so many people unfortunately have. So all of those, like the clothing, the food, the shelter, the cell phone, all of that, it was handed to me. And I'm so grateful that I have a support system that did that for me. I'm so very mindful of how few people have that privilege. And that's one of the things that I would hope that we can change, but that's a whole different story.
I
think
think of it like, oh, I'm sorry, Lindsay, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, you go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I think of it as like those resources that you say that so many people don't have, and it's true. So many people getting out of prison are neglected of them. Hopefully through the state, hopefully through the prison, the programming, those things can start to be provided because I feel like they're they're necessary for when you're getting out. Otherwise, I mean, you're just asking to go back. You're not giving the proper ways to get licensing, to get your job, to get to where you need to be. I feel like it's just setting you up for failure just to head right back to the prison.
Oh, absolutely. And, a lot of the people that I've maintained contact with or stories I've heard since, the stereotypical story I hear that is so opposite mine is a person leaves prison, still traumatized and still wounded, right? I mean, the class I was taking for, heroin treatment was the lady kept saying, so you just need to have a rubber band on your wrist. And whenever you're craving and you want to use, just slap it. Just slap it. And so I was in this class for weeks, and that was the coping mechanism that this woman is trying to explain. And I'm thinking, like, all right, I've never used heroin, but I'm pretty sure that if it was just as easy as slapping a wrist with a rubber band, I'm pretty sure people would choose that over heroin and give up.
Yeah.
I think the general message from heroin users that like it's really crappy and really impossible to get away from. But like, and
that's not working.
I think of all of these people who are getting out of prison ill-equipped mentally because they haven't been given tools and resources to learn healthy coping tools. And then they're told, you have to find a job, but then who's going to hire someone who's just out of prison? I mean, I had trouble getting a job and I had a master's degree. So, someone who's coming out of prison
that says something.
Yeah. Like, and, doesn't even have a high school diploma. How are they going to get an edge up, And then they're required, like restitution is on the table. I mean, I had restitution that I was supposed to pay it off by the time my parole was over, but there was no like minimum monthly payment or anything like that. And so I see the scenario with other inmates where, people transition out of prison and they don't have a way to get housing. They don't have a way to get mental health support. They don't have a way to get a job. And then they violate parole because they're not employed or they don't have housing. And it's like this really terrible catch-22 where like, how are you supposed to do that? Because these things don't all add up.
Yeah. It seems like somebody's making money somewhere that's keeping people somewhere.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the thing too, right? Is once you kind of pull the veil up and it's like seeing the wizard behind the curtain, it's like, oh, all of this is for profit. It's not to rehabilitate people. It's not to heal them.
Yeah, don't call it a correctional facility or rehabilitative efforts.
No,
Yeah.
it's for profit, plain and simple.
Yep.
That's really
That's why I'm really I try to be a advocate and just super vocal about I don't know, just preaching being an ex-con or staying out of prison or telling people like you don't have to take that route. You don't have to continue in this cycle. Just go be yourself, express yourself, find out what you want to offer the world. And speaking of that, Lindsay, what is your life trajectory looking like 5 years from now? So you're an ex-con now, with a felony on your record. What does this look like 5 years from now, your career, your current career, things you want to do? What does life look like?
5 years from now, I would really hope that I can use my experiences with incarceration for good. I've written a book about my experience. I would love to see my own story be shared to help other people through a lot of the challenges I faced. I hope to have a role in some policy shifting. I have the skills with my nonprofit experience to work in policy reform and that sort of thing, and I would love to do it with incarceration, because it's one of those things where I've reflected on so greatly, and I feel really kind of paradoxical about it, because on the one hand, prison was the worst thing that ever happened, but on the other hand, it was the best thing that ever happened. And so how do we take the good things, right? Like the isolation away from your normal routine, I think is probably a good thing for a lot of people. But then how do we create that in an environment that's healing, that is trauma informed, that treats people like humans with dignity and respect? And, looking at all of the European models, especially of what prison looks like in Norway or, in Holland,
They're doing something right.
yeah, and recidivism is low. And so it's like, okay, so how do we make this better so that it's actually a useful tool and can actually help people? And I would really love to have a contribution in that 5 year. I mean, 5 years from now in my whole life, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the suffering I experienced and I saw others experience is so preventable.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know any person who's an ex-con who the prison system worked for them.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that stands out the most to me, Lindsay, during my prison experience, I did this 18-month Christian faith-based intensive program that was had this community of prisoners that wanted to be there for, it didn't take any time off prison sentences, but it was more of like people would see it on the record, like, okay, you want this, you've done this, so it looks good, so you can move on to this place in the prison facility or this program or whatever. But during that program I was in for 18 months, that sense of community, whether it was real or fake or forced upon us, it was more human inside prison during that period than I'd ever experienced. It was like you could expect, if you saw somebody bleeding on the ground, to help them. Like in prison, that's very, very uncommon. You walk over them, you don't make it your business, because otherwise it is your business then. So it's like that sense of community, if you can, that I experienced, and I'm sure other people have experienced, but if you can make community inside prison and not divide on all, the skin color or the gang, and come together on, okay, we're trying to stay out of this place together or just be better. I think prison systems would do so much better, and we wouldn't have to rely on the prison systems. It's just people coming together, community, just people coming together, as anything, gangs come together, groups come together, education comes together. It's just people saying we're going to stay out of here and not no longer come back.
Well, and I'm really grateful that you had that experience while you were incarcerated, because I know I certainly didn't. I felt like I had to be censored all the time and be very aware of anything I said. Either an inmate could use it against me or a guard could use it against me, and I didn't know which one. And so I never felt that safety in that space. But I did, both before and after prison. And I wish that there was some kind of social support system to reintegrate people out of incarceration in, like, I don't think we need, I mean, not to like make a direct example, but let's say we don't need an AA group, right? We don't need to all go around and be like, hey, my name is Lindsay, I'm a former felon. like having some trouble adjusting. Like what I would really love is like, please introduce me to like a cooking class or a book club, or like put me in a
great.
right. Like I'm not the only person who's a felon, but let's look at all of these other skills, because I know like there's this one woman I was in prison with, and she was like in her late 40s at the time, in and out of prison since her teens, right? I mean, the kind of person who's like, well, I was in this state and this charge and 87 here and this, I mean, just like hundreds and hundreds of things. And she's going to be a lifer. And the reality and the sad truth of it is that I remember a conversation with her where she had said she never had a bank account. And she's like, so how does that work when you get utilities? Like, how do you get gas or water? And it's those kinds of things that, like, how is someone supposed to exist in society if you don't know how to secure utilities in your apartment or have a bank account or balance a bank account, right? I mean,
yeah, you won't get far. I remember meeting people that didn't know how to do their own laundry in prison.
yeah.
Thinking like, you don't know how to wash your own drawers? Like, dude,
Yeah. Or
life's going to get harder.
Yeah, even education. There was one woman in her like 70s, and she approached me once and asked if I would teach her how to read. And I thought she was messing with me because of the people she was friends with. Like I thought I was being tricked into something and I didn't know what. And I was really
you're like, what?
Right. And then I realized she had never learned how to read. She got pulled out of school in the 3rd grade and never learned.
Never went back, just started doing whatever life.
Yeah. So the prison system does a disservice to every person who's incarcerated, because rather than saying, okay, here's this person's challenge, they don't know how to read, let's fix that. This person needs some financial education, let's fix that. I mean, there's if we focused energy on healing original traumas, right, on how this person got broken somehow, how do we care for them and help them, then that person, all of a sudden, like robbing a bank doesn't have the appeal. If they have the resources to have their own job and livelihood where they're not struggling, it's not going to have the same appeal. And I don't see the prison system having any acknowledgement or social responsibility for the damage done, right? I mean, I know for my case, I could have used, like, I wish that the Office of Victim Services, after I left my partner, my husband, I wish they would have said, you need to be in mandatory therapy, right? As part of receiving services from Office of Victim Services, you need to be in therapy, and you need to keep a journal, and you need to find someone to talk to. Like, I wish someone would have said, you just went through some really hard, traumatic events. These things are here. Here's your tool belt. Like, use these.
Use them. Yeah.
And, recidivism, I think about the people I do know that have gone back, and it's because they don't have those tools. And, I sometimes I feel guilty that I can't share my privilege in that way, right? I can't share my master's degree with someone else, but it's a reality that, like, I know I'm never going back to prison because of the privilege I have, because of the education I have, because of the social support that I have. And it's not fair to 99% of inmates who don't have that.
It's true. It is 99% true, Lindsay. It is. But I think, too, through everything that you're doing, through advocacy, creating media and speaking, being vocal about the experiences inside prison and your perspective on them helps people, because it changes and creates that communication, that conversation that needs to happen for those things to change,
Yeah. Well, and I love, even your podcast too. It's, because when we humanize these stories and understand that, the Hollywood version is you get some bad criminal and you put them in prison and then they come out not a bad criminal. And that's a fairy tale. So how do we, talk about the reality of what this is and how we can do better? Because there's certainly ways to do better.
Yeah. And make it more human. Just like you said, just like the experience inside prison of I've always come back to this, of them having the lowly charge of a sex offender and just looking past that as a human. That's that same concept, getting out of prison and changing and being a better person, and people accepting second chances, because I think the world needs to be more acceptable to accepting those and accepting people back into society, not just throwing them away. Because we throw away a lot of people, I feel like, or just house them in a prison and we never see from them again. We never hear from them. I think that's a bad practice on everybody's part.
Yeah, well, and the other thing that I'd like to point out is, since I've been out of prison, there's been things that I've struggled with that are a direct result of prison. And the system is designed in a way that damages anyone who goes through it. Even through all of the therapy I've had, all of the self work I've done, like I'm at peace with the prison situation, like all of that. I mean, it's taken me a lot of work to get to where I am now. And it doesn't have to be that way. I don't see it being necessary for guards to treat inmates the way that they're treated. And all of these like feelings of scarcity, right? I don't know about your experience, but in prison, it's always seemed like there was never enough toothpaste, never enough soap, never enough cleaner. Like you got 2 shirts, not 10. Like it was always this like feeling of scarcity. And, I've wrestled with finding joy in my life and having that sense of awe and wonder and being able to like appreciate the miraculous, because those are scars that run really deep. And what does that say about our society, right? Where's the accountability that we're willing to put people through that?
Yeah, torture. It's torture. I think too, I will say this, inside the prison systems, there's these little gems and these diamonds of individuals, whether a counselor, a guard. There's people that I swear they just bleed. They want you to do so good and never come back. And those people stand out the most inside those facilities. I swear that they literally are gold mines and keeping people out of prison while all their coworkers, in essence, are bringing everybody back. But big shout out to those people, because any guard, I'm sure you met a couple guards that you probably connected with. There's few that during my prison sentence that were just like, I swear, angels that made me feel like, man, make me feel so good about myself that I don't want to come back,
There were a handful of kindnesses that meant a great deal, of people who had my best interest at heart. And, there was a therapist, she was able to work the system so I was able to complete my requirements, even though I wasn't able to complete my requirements. I was told to do this drug and alcohol program that was supposed to be 11 months long, but my points, like the way that I ranked as an inmate, my points weren't high enough to qualify for the program. And so it was this like, okay, you have to do this program, but you're not eligible for it kind of thing. And so she found a way for me to do individualized therapy with her so that I could meet that qualification. And she did it because she saw that I didn't need to learn how to like slap the rubber band. It needed to be different. And I'm grateful for the wonderful people and moments that they did give me, because those kindnesses were certainly, in dark days, one small kindness can feel the weight of the world. That's for sure.
Huge. Yeah. I love that. Lindsay, okay, so if we're speaking you the day before you went to prison, we're speaking you as a kid, anybody out there that's listening, maybe the things that your parents went through while you were incarcerated, maybe there's somebody's parents out there, similar circumstances. What would you have to say to them? Just advice on life, advice in prison, advice in handling tough circumstances. What would your advice be to your younger self or someone like you?
That every opportunity can be made as good or bad as you want it to be. That, whether you're the person in prison or a loved one is in prison, or you are the victim of someone who's in prison, whatever that thing is, you are faced with something that will either be your best blessing or your worst curse, and you get to choose. That it's not how good the guards are or how mean the guards are. It's not what my abuser did. It's not that, that jerk guy caught you on camera and that's why you're in prison. Like, it's none of that. It's like, okay, just accept that this is where you are right now. Stop fighting that. Just accept it. Like, this is the situation. And you can either choose to make it the best thing that happens to you, to where you grow into a version of yourself that you're proud of and that you can stand by and say, yeah, I did all that work. That's amazing. Or you can take a path where you create your own suffering and you will suffer as much as you possibly can. So it's the most empowering place that you can be in is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for sharing your thoughts and your words, experiences. It was lovely hearing it. I'm sure the audience is going to love it. For everybody listening, there's going to be description or down in the video description below. You guys can find all her social links everywhere where you can keep up with her journey and all that good stuff. And yeah, Lindsay, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. It was very, very cool to hear.
Alexander the Great, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate our time today.
Yeah. I'm wishing you nothing but blessings in your life, and keep doing you. I think it's super cool to hear of your experience and how you're giving back. Like, a lot of people try to just forget about it, but I think embrace it every single day. Wake up and remember it.
Yeah,
it's part of you,
lean in and bear witness to it, and then use it as fuel.